Good afternoon. It's 3:30 p.m. on Monday, January 29th, 2024, and I am calling this special meeting to order. Commissioner President of the Board, Bob Isle, is unable to attend today, and as Vice President, I will be acting in his absence. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion to approve the agenda.
Any discussion? This would is so. Really want to call a point of order?
Yes, I would, commissioners, we had a placeholder for an executive session. If the commissioners don't feel that that's going to be needed today, then this would be a good opportunity to amend the agenda to remove the executive session from the agenda, and unless you feel that it's needed or any of the commissioners do.
I would move to amend the agenda to remove the executive session item D.
Second.
Is there discussion from you, Commissioner?
I don't have a desire for an executive session unless any of my fellow commissioners do. In which case, I'm fine leaving it on.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to amend our agenda to remove the executive session. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, are there any further amendments? All those in favor of approving the agenda as amended, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. Our agenda is approved. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Camille St. Onge, our Director of Strategic Initiatives and Commission Affairs, to explain about our work session today.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that, Commissioner. So the Department of Enterprise Services is joining us here today. This is an advisory presentation. We're not asking you to take any action, and I'll turn it back over to you, Commissioner, to welcome Ann Larson and team.
Thank you.
It's in your, I will take that. So Ann Larson from the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services is joining us today, and she has an entourage of her colleagues here with her that are going to be talking to us about the Deschutes Estuary project. And from there, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Larson, and your presentation is up here. I'm going to grab you a clicker.
Wonderful. Well, while she's doing that, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Again, I'm Ann Larson. I'm Special Assistant to the Director for the Department of Enterprise Services. I also serve in the capacity as the Project Director for the Deschutes Estuary Restoration. With me, I have some important ladies. Tessa, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tessa Gardner-Brown. I'm a principal at Floyd Snyder. I'm the consultant team project manager and was also the consultant team project manager in the environmental impact statement phase, which ran from 2019 to 2022. Working very closely with Sarah and Lorelei.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Rich. I'm a project director at ECHO Northwest, and we've been supporting the funding and governance work group. And then we prepared the economic analysis for the EIS, so have been involved through that process.
And I'm Lorelei Johnson, also with ECHO Northwest, and also doing all those things that Sarah just described.
Well, today we're going to give you a brief presentation. I know a lot of folks know a little bit about this project, and there are some new faces around the table. So we want to give you an overview of some of the work that we did as we worked towards the environmental impact statement, the final. We worked closely with the ports and some of you folks here around the table to develop an MOU, and want to talk a little bit about the next steps for that. I think folks are aware that we are looking to take the MOU that we've got with some of the jurisdictions to a final interlocal agreement by the end of this year. And so I want to talk through some of those steps, but this is an opportunity for you to ask questions. I know we have an hour and a half, so we'll try to be brief. I know we prepared for 2 hours, but yeah, welcome. Some of you new to this process. We're excited to talk to you a little bit about this project. What's that?
And I just want to rest on that last point that Ann just made for 1 second. We totally invite any questions that you have. Please feel free to stop us. That's the whole purpose of today's conversation, is really acknowledging that we have a new group of individuals here at the port, but also at a number of the other entities that we're coordinating closely with. So we're working throughout January and February to meet with those entities and do exactly this, orient you to the project, to some assumptions that we made collectively with the group in the memorandum of understanding process, and make sure that we all have had a chance to be briefed on it and feel good about it before we dive into the process of negotiating this coming year. Okay. Oh. It doesn't center perfectly, but I'll still go forward. Okay. So in 2022, at the end of the environmental impact statement, Enterprise Services identified the estuary restoration as the preferred alternative for long-term management of the water body, and has since taken action under an allocation from the Washington State Legislature, the Climate Commitment Act dollars, to move forward with design and permitting of estuary restoration. We get asked often, what are the primary components of the estuary? So we're going to cover that in this slide, and then some of the benefits as well. So the estuary restoration includes, at the start of construction, dredging about 500,000 cubic yards of sediment that has accumulated behind the dam since the dam was installed in 1951. And that dredging will focus on the main channel of the Deschutes estuary. There are a number of benefits to that dredging. One of the first ones is that it reduces downstream sedimentation after construction by about 48%. So that's a big deal for the port. Additionally, it allows us to reuse that dredged material to construct new habitat along the shorelines of the estuary, so that will increase that ecological and visual diversity of the shorelines after construction. So it won't just be mudflats, it'll be mudflats and varied ecology that we're working closely with the tribe and WDFW on.
Reduces downstream sedimentation relative to what?
The 48% reduction is if we were to remove the dam without having done any dredging, there would be a significant increase relative to a scenario where we do that dredging in the beginning before the dam is removed. And that 48% metric is compared to the deposition that would occur at Olympia Yacht Club because they're the closest. Okay, so we dredge and then we create significant habitat along the shorelines. Also, at the start of construction, a new Fifth Avenue bridge will be built, and that bridge will have 2 vehicle lanes, but also improved bike and pedestrian lanes because it's the primary bike and ped corridor for the city of Olympia. We have to do that at the beginning of construction to move traffic to the bridge so that eventually we can remove the dam and restore tidal flow to the estuary. The other components of this are recreational. There will be a new hand-carried boat launch installed, about a mile of boardwalks, and a restored fishing pier. That's the primary components that will be addressed during construction. And construction could begin as soon as 2027 and would continue for 7 to 8 years after that. After construction, there will be maintenance dredging in West Bay and navigational areas of West Bay. And that is the piece of the project that we are speaking to when we refer to the memorandum of understanding. So that memorandum of understanding is all about long-term dredging in West Bay to support navigational uses, recreational or operational at the port. And that is a primary component of estuary restoration. So when we think about estuary restoration, there are a handful of benefits. It's a multi-benefit project that really provides benefits to the natural environment and the built environment. Estuary and habitat is some of the most valuable habitat to our Endangered Species Act listed salmon that are the southern resident killer whale depend on, and we'll be restoring 260 acres of that estuarine habitat. We also have shown that removal of the dam will reduce flooding elevations by up to 1 foot across the city of Olympia, which is very important given the sea level rise conditions here. It addresses the chronic water quality violations that have been identified by the Department of Ecology. Also for the port, we have seen an opportunity for, in the future, after the dam is restored or after the dam is removed, for that long-term sediment to potentially cover areas of low contamination that exist within West Bay. And so that is something that at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about a separate technical track to work together in our design as you're designing your cleanup and we're designing our project and how sediment moves across the system. Are there areas where we can remove from dredging during your cleanup action and assume and show and model that sediment will deposit from the estuary in those areas of low contamination. So I bring that up because we see that as a primary benefit of this project because it could reduce port cleanup costs on the order of millions. And I think those are the high points for this slide. Okay. So on this slide, this shows the anticipated progression for design and permitting, which began in late 2023 and would continue through the end of 2026. And what you'll see is that between the start of the project in mid-2024, we'll be working to develop conceptual design from that EIS level. And a key component of that is targeted stakeholder engagement that will occur in February, March, so about halfway through that conceptual design process, so that we can work in focused conversations with key stakeholders to solicit and integrate their input into the project design. So a good example of that is the City of Olympia will be working closely with us about the design criteria for the Fifth Avenue Bridge and the Fifth Avenue Bridge experience, or similarly, the Squaxin Island Tribe helping us to determine biological design criteria for the habitat. After mid-2024, when we've delivered the conceptual design, we'll continue work through the end of 2024 to deliver 30% design. That will also include a cost estimate. And we'll include that a similar round of stakeholder engagement so that as the state designs the project, stakeholder input is integrated and reflected into the final design. One thing that you see very importantly on this screen is there's a box around the latter half of the design process starting at mid-2024, and it says additional funding is needed to proceed with design and permitting. So the allocation that we received from the legislature gets us to about mid-2024. And we are currently seeking, and in partnership with the Port of Olympia, on some grant funding for additional design, permitting, and construction. If we receive those funds, we could accelerate this schedule or move consistent with this schedule. If additional funding does not come through, this schedule would be elongated, as you would assume.
As far as the stakeholders are, is the Army Corps and the maritime industry represented as stakeholders?
The maritime industry is included in the Community Sounding Board, which is a group of about 25 individuals that we are convening. They have representation through Olympia Yacht Club, the other West Bay Marinas, the Recreational Boaters Association. So they will be with us in this engagement, and then we'll start regulatory engagement once we determine whether additional funds have been obtained so that we can move through the rest of the project. So we hopefully, if we receive funding, the Corps would be engaged mid this year. The good news is that the Corps was engaged in the EIS process and has reviewed the estuary alternative relative to regulatory feasibility and the change to deposition in the nav channel, and has not expressed any fatal flaws from that review at that time.
Okay, and as far as the maritime industry, what I heard, and maybe it was just not on your list, were more recreational boaters. Are there stevedores or longshoremen or, you know, the actual ship traffic that the Port of Olympia supports that are involved in this conversation? Anyone that's actually involved in like shipping?
Interesting. We haven't assumed or seen a nexus with them yet, because our assumption is that the port vessel berth would be maintained consistent with what is needed for operations, and there would be no change to that, but I would be happy to learn more from you about what we're missing.
It's more so that it just seems like dominoes to me, and that everything's kind of connected as far as how we engineer the solutions for future sediment management. And so I agree with what you said, and I'm just curious whether there's expertise from people who've been dealing with navigable channel dredging that may lend itself to an engineered solution that isn't being considered because we're only talking about 40-foot recreational boaters' point of view.
Totally.
And the nexus between the navigable channel and the non-navigable channel, to me, those are the entities that haven't necessarily been coordinating
Say that Tessa's kind of speaking to like more of a community sounding board.
Sure.
And so they have a limited scope of what they're working on, like understanding pedestrian access or walkways and whatnot, but that's a really good point of how we engage that broader group too, so.
It just seems like sometimes those are absent from the initial stakeholder feedback and then they aren't included in the design and then you get too far down the road too.
It's something we can talk about, how we engage at the technical side of the port to make sure that we've got the right people when we start to look at engineering some of those ideas and solutions, so. Thank you.
And maybe when you move ahead to slide 7, you could talk a little bit about, you've been mentioning the yacht club is the nearest affected. And then, of course, the port operations for the terminal are at the far tip.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that, definitely. And we will talk about sediment planning with the
Yeah.
port coming up in 24, which we have a proposal to you on.
Cool.
All right. So as we transition here into, for those of you who are new, walking through what the memorandum of understanding contains, and we have some slides around that. We wanted to start with some of the foundations that underpin the process that led to the ultimate MOU and what's contained within that. And it really came down to an understanding that there are benefits that arise from agreeing to a plan to maintain the working waterfront and recreational boating in West Bay, because that generates benefits by supporting the dredging activities. It generates benefits associated with the economic activity of those areas and the health of the businesses and the leases that are associated with that. So there's benefits associated with maintaining the boating and the working waterfront, and that also enables the entire project to move forward into implementation, which produces a whole host of other benefits arising from the estuary creation. So things like the public amenities and transportation, the waterfront and port related economic activity already talked about, a lot of opportunities for enhancing quality of life and building social capital around a return to the waterfront and bringing people to the water. And then reduced regulatory uncertainty in a variety of ways. So this suite of benefits are enjoyed locally and regionally, and it produces a nexus with each of the partners around the table and enables them to understand, you know, we're going into this this agreement and everybody will benefit. There's a unique position, and you'll see this later when we get to the funding allocation with the city of Olympia, recognizing that this water body is right at its adjacent to right at the front door, and Olympia stands to have the greatest tie economically to those benefits, or enjoying the stream of benefits that come along. And so it would have a greater share of the cost. So throughout the conversation, there was this weighing of, you know, what are the costs of doing this and what are the benefits that we receive, and an attempt to connect those things for each of the partners across the way. And that's really served as the foundation for moving forward through the negotiations of the memorandum of understanding. Let's shift to the next slide.
And I would just add one thing to what Sarah said, and or maybe highlight one thing that Sarah said, that, you know, there is this shared agreement that the working and vibrant waterfront produces benefits for all. And so that is an integral component of estuary restoration, is continuing to do the work to achieve those benefits, which are realized through that maintenance dredging. And so I think particularly for the port, it's important for us all to understand that there is consensus amongst the funding and governance work group that we will be working toward, you know, the dredging that is needed to maintain navigability for operational and recreational vessels.
I have a question. Was there any economic analysis in any of the work that showed the benefit of what the outcome? And purpose of one, just for knowledge, but two, I want to make sure that our commissioners have access to that so that they're informed as they evaluate the MOU, any potential ILAs. So I'll work with you directly to make sure I pinpoint that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I can say there was an economic analysis planning level in the EIS process comparing the across the alternatives. And then qualitative analysis that helps to ground some of this in the MOU process that's part of the funding and governance record. And we can share all of that with you. There wasn't a detailed, highly quantitative economic analysis of the ultimate outcome because, you know, that was not the level that we were at that time.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I totally get that.
Tessa, both you and Sarah have mentioned the funding and governance work group. I don't think, is there a slide of who's a part of that?
Oh, my goodness.
Let's go there. Let's go to the next slide and you'll.
Yeah, you'll see the
The entities.
Yeah, so
Oh,
the information, the drop off that we usually provide here, the funding and governance work group was created in 2008.
Yep.
As directly from the legislative proviso that required the project to consider the shared funding and governance responsibility of the project. And so it was created with that intention and that objective in 2016 and went through the EIS process to do just that. And so it was made up of these entities that you see in the left column in this table. So the state of Washington, both DNR and DES, the Squaxin Island Tribe, the city of Olympia, the city of Tumwater, the port, Thurston County, and Lot.
I think it's worth knowing, because I think maybe we have some new faces. We also had an executive work group with leaders of those different jurisdictions and municipalities. And then we also had technical work groups that we engaged folks like fish and wildlife, ecology. And so there were different levels that we had early on and the different levels of stakeholder engagement when we were developing the EIS. So this was just one component of that towards the MOU. Understanding governance.
Thanks for continuing to interrupt with these great
Yeah.
questions. Just keep them coming.
who doesn't love a good costume?
That's right. Okay, so as the group went through the process of trying to understand how the long-term operational components of the project would be funded and governed, and actually what those long-term operational components would be. You know, we had this discussion of benefits and why we're doing this. And then had quite a bit of discussion around, you know, what could the funding sources be? How would these things be governed? And ultimately, what you'll see reflected in the memorandum of understanding is a recognition that a lot of the physical assets that would be created from this project that you might, you know, could conceivably be things that are governable, need to be dealt with in the long term, would actually be more appropriately dealt with by transferring to an entity that is dedicated to doing the kinds of things that involve. For example, the city of Olympia with the new Fifth Avenue Bridge. Once the bridge is constructed, it would DES would transfer ownership of the bridge to the city of Olympia, and it would become part of its transportation network. The South Basin boardwalks would similarly go to the city of Tumwater because it's within, you know, their park area. Several of the non-physical assets, the responsibilities involved in ensuring that the dredging program proceeds would also be able to be peeled off in ways that an entity could take responsibility, an existing entity, rather than creating a new entity with another layer of bureaucracy to handle. So the bathymetric surveys that would happen on an annual basis to monitor sediment. And then when sediment, a dredge is identified to need to happen, the designing, permitting, contract management for that dredge would go to the state. And a variety of the other pieces of infrastructure that are adjacent to or within the existing Capitol campus would go to the state to manage. WDFW would manage the some of the recreational infrastructure and responsibilities there. So when we went through the list, the Port of Olympia, importantly here for the discussion today, would take on the bathymetric surveys, design, permitting, contract management within the berths, because that's what you all are paying attention to anyway. So that was peeled off from, you know, the state responsibility within the marinas and the other areas. So that is really how the memorandum of understanding is structured and some of the assumptions that we are carrying into the ILA negotiation process. And I'll pause there because there's a lot. Any questions on that?
I spoke with one of our engineers about navigable channels being abandoned and examples of that. Are there examples of navigable channels being expanded?
Expanded.
Like if the navigable channel went further down?
Oh,
I'm just curious.
yeah. Oh, I don't want to speak out of turn. I will have to explore that, but what's coming to mind for me is, you know, how the Columbia River has developed and we have continued to
Right.
bring commerce up with the ports as they increase
Right.
upriver. But we're on camera and I don't want to speak.
You don't have to answer right now. I'm more so, just trying to understand how all the pieces work with
Yeah.
each other. So, okay.
We'll follow up on that, though. It's a good question.
Yeah, it's probably irrelevant, but.
As we sit here puzzling about the pieces, and if you could put a finer point on kind of the timing and why it was important in the timeline of this work for us to get on board.
Oh, for like the MOU
Or
or?
be helpful to understand how this presentation fits into like next action from governance.
I mean, I think we're gonna get there, but we'll go there here now. So we have $7 million in climate commitment act funding, and as Tessa mentioned, that we're gonna get through conceptual design by mid of this year. We need additional funding to get us to 30%. And with that 30%, we'd have certainty on a little bit better cost estimates of what we would go to through the legislature in a 2025 ask for the biennium. The interlocal agreement, the importance of that is if we get that signed with a legally binding document for the jurisdictions around the table, we can come to the legislature saying the municipalities, the jurisdiction, the tribes, everybody is on board with long-term management of the estuary, the sediment. And so it's an important part when we're going after a large ask by the state legislature to show that the partners are at the table looking to help take care of the operations and maintenance and sediment management into the future. The legislature told us that we needed to come up with an ILA so we are under a legislative mandate to come up with an ILA by the end of this year. And as Tessa mentioned, we have $7 million to get us through conceptual design. The money that we also have will get us through completing the ILA too. So
Yeah.
it's not the 30% design. We'd need some additional funds to get to that point, but we have enough funding to get through this negotiation of the ILA. That's the critical nature of it, is because we hope to come to the state legislature with an ask this upcoming 2025 session. Keeping in mind that we also have several different funding options that we're looking at through federal funds with NOAA. We've got several grant applications out, which is really exciting. Some of them have been working closely with Sean and City of Olympia. So a lot of things out there.
And as far as the port's concerned, we were a little late to the party at formally declaring our support for both projects. But we did do that last year through a resolution of the commission stating that the Port of Olympia is in support. And so just reiterating that that is where the port continues to want to support that and make it very clear that we are wanting to partner on that.
If I could take, oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
It's my understanding that all of the entities would have to contribute annually to a dredge fund. It wasn't clear to me, what would the port's contribution be annually? Is it 3 million or is that?
Is it all right if we advance in?
Oh, yeah, okay.
We'll go through that in painstaking detail. Last week.
But it's,
Almost there.
it might be worth putting into context. We have some draft documents we haven't shared. We're waiting for some potential feedback on, but how this lines up with the port's remediation. And so maybe it's worth, like, if we talk about 3 to 5 years of design and permitting, as I mentioned, 7 to 8 years, and you all have your project that's going on. We talk for a minute about how that would line up, just so folks have a greater sense
Okay.
of the bigger timeline.
Sure.
Because I think that's helpful, because you've got some big projects underway.
Really? So during the process to develop the MOU, we were in really close coordination with the port, and we have always understood that you all are running your process to develop the cleanup and response to contaminated sediment and Bud Inlet. And we understand that now you are sampling out in West Bay, or maybe you're just finishing, but now-ish. And that is really the first step in getting you toward your cleanup action coordination with ecology, and potentially moving into cleanup action in 2025 through 2027, 2028, let's say. The earliest that a DES would start construction for the estuary restoration would be 2027. And then it's about a 7 to 8 year window after DES starts estuary restoration. So when we line those two projects up, what we see is that the sediment cleanup is several years ahead of removal of the dam. And that sequencing is very important, of course, because we would want the dredging of known contaminated sediment to happen before additional deposition heads downstream. And so that's an assumption that's in the memorandum of understanding. And right now, what we're seeing is both agencies are taking action consistent with that timeline that I just charted out. And we'll, of course, be in close coordination over the coming years. I wanted to add just one point to what you made earlier, that part of the importance for meeting today is because we're doing, we're kicking off the process to start the interlocal agreement. And we want to have these foundational meetings now at the beginning of the year with everyone in this open forum, question and answer, so that then we can really drive into planning and governance work group meetings throughout the rest of the year to hit that target at the end of the year.
Yeah, and we'll be bringing back this funding and governance group with the different jurisdictions here after these one-on-one meetings. So that everybody's coming from the same place. There's a lot of new faces with the election this last year, so
Okay.
we jump into it.
Now we want to get to cost.
Yeah.
Okay, no, we can't skip that
No,
slide though.
we gotta go.
Help in the back.
Okay,
Oh, perfect,
Okay.
thank you.
so to figure out costs, we first have to figure out how much we're dredging and how often we're dredging it. And so how did we do that? During the environmental impact statement process, the EIS, we worked with the marinas and with the port to determine what would be a significant impact to your operations. And what we heard from the marinas was that if 10% of their vessels were impacted due to deposition, that would be considered significant to them. And what we heard from the port is that if you had to wait greater than 4 hours on a tidal cycle to get enough water so that you could bring in a fully loaded ship, that would be a significant impact. We understand that you guys are essentially doing that on some of the extreme tides now, and that is considered an impact to your operations. So then what we did is we modeled the sediment deposition patterns under the estuary alternative, and we looked at how quickly sediment would accumulate such that those significance thresholds were met. And what we saw is that on average, we would need to dredge at about every 6 years for the Olympia Yacht Club and every 12 years for the other marinas and the port in order to stay below those thresholds that I just identified. So once again, that would be a 12-year frequency for the Port of Olympia. Importantly, sediment doesn't come downstream at the same rate every single year. In high flow years, more sediment comes down, and in low flow years, less sediment comes down. And so the dredging should be responsive to actual environmental conditions. And the way that we assure that is by including in the MOU a commitment to an annual bathymetric survey in the marinas and in the federal nav channel and port customers. That would help us to compress or increase our timeline and really have dredging be responsive to those significant thresholds that we identified. But when we look at it on average, we are able to get that dredging frequency that I just described. So then what we do is we estimate that. And we know that dredging at the marinas costs different than what dredging at the port vessel berths costs, and the Federal Navigation Channel is a little bit different. And so we do a big costing exercise with our team of engineers to determine how much sediment is coming from where and how much does that cost. Once we did that, we developed that in a range, of course, as you would assume. And we took the high end of that range. And from there, we then looked at how much that would, we estimated for 30 years. And then we looked at the value of dredging that would occur between dam removal and 2050. And I use 2050 because 2050 is the end date for this agreement as it's currently written. And Sarah will talk more about the significance of 2050. So just right now, hold that as true, that we look at the prorated costs for that. And then we, from there, let's allocate the cost per entity. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide here. So give me 1 second. Okay, so the total, I'm gonna rattle off some numbers that aren't on this slide, but this is all in the environmental impact statement, so you can go back and grab it. The total high end of the estimate for dredging over 30 years is 71 million. That assumes in-water disposal because of the reason that we just talked about, where the port will have dredged and addressed contaminated sediment in West Bay before the dam is removed, and we sampled the sediment upstream of the dam and it meets sediment management standard criteria. Then we prorated that value, and that's for the years of the agreement, and that gets us to about a $37.7 million value. Then per request from the port, Lisa Parks, who used to work here, we pulled out the allocation from the Corps, and we set that aside because that's negotiated separately. And then what we did is we removed baseline dredging. This is a really important point. So baseline dredging, when I say that, that is the amount of, that is dredging to be responsive to the amount of sediment that would deposit under scenario where the dam is maintained. The increase to that is what the Funding and Governance Work Group is addressing. So you take the dam out, you have an increased amount of sediment, and that's the funding that this work group is allocating amongst itself. So very importantly, it holds the assumption that the entities that are currently dredging in West Bay would continue to dredge in West Bay. So those two numbers compound. And now I'll suggest that everybody take a look at your table, and I'm going to walk you through each column in the table, and we'll get to your question there about how much does everybody pay in annually. So the first column is, of course, the entities that are party to the agreement and have signed the memorandum of understanding. The second column is the allocation for maintenance dredging. And what you'll see is that it's an even allocation to each entity, but for the City of Olympia that has a 50% increase beyond the other entities. And that goes back to the point that Sarah was making, that all entities receive benefits from the maintenance of a working and vibrant waterfront. And the City of Olympia realizes an additional amount of those benefits given their proximity or their location relative to the project. The third column, excuse me, is the amount of maintenance dredging that is equivalent to baseline for the duration of this agreement. It's important here to show that the port has some level of annual some level of maintenance dredging costs within the term of the agreement, and that the marinas do. We get the question a lot about, do the marinas have any responsibility for maintenance dredging after the dam is removed? And the answer is yes, they do. Their responsibility would be consistent to the dredging amount that would be required under the scenario where the dam is maintained. And the other entities would take the increase in dredging responsibility, and that is in the next column. So when you look at that next column, you can see the total amount for maintenance dredging of that increased sediment is about 18 million. That is divided equally amongst the parties based on the, 15.4% for everybody, except for the city of Olympia gets an extra 50%. And that comes to a total amount of 2.865 million. What we have determined in the memorandum of understanding is that the payment for that would occur annually once the state has secured funding for construction, because that gives you all certainty that the project's actually gonna go forward. We don't want you paying in a fund until that point. If you then annualize that total value through the time of when the state may receive funding through 2050, the term of the agreement, that's about $120,000 a year payment for most entities. 180 for the city of Olympia because they have that 50% increase in cost. The last thing, the next table, the next column over is the baseline plus the increased cost. So you can see that the sum of the port's two columns are shown in that one, 3.2 million. And then the next column shows that the state is responsible for estuary construction. That was a question that we worked through with the Funding and Governance Work Group about whether any of these entities should also be responsible for some amount of construction, given the benefits that a constructed estuary realizes. And we landed on the determination that the construction responsibility should fall to the state. So that's what's represented in this row. And then when you look at that all in column, when you look at that all in total, what you'll see is that each entity has about 1% of the total share when you look at construction and long-term dredging through 2050. That was the painstaking detail I promised you.
And to go back to the question about timing, knowing that the state is going to be really responsible for the total amount of the capital costs, it's even why it's so much more important that the folks that are benefiting around the table, that we show that commitment, that they're going to be taking care of this operations, maintenance of that in the future.
So am I interpreting it correctly that our obligation is $120,000 a year through 2050? And then what happens in 2050? Because that's 1 or 2 dredges, depending, I mean, it's not that. But if they're 12-year dredges, by the time we get the work done, right?
You remember that Olympia Yacht Club has a frequency of every
Right,
6
6.
years, and the total dollar is shared equally amongst all parties. So every 6 years, that's 3 dredges in the 18-year term of the agreement.
So that just doesn't seem like very long, I guess is my point. This is what keeps coming up with stakeholders is this uncertainty around funding.
Yep.
So I would be remiss if I did not ask the question. So
That's what we're here
what
for.
is the plan after 2050? Because it's still gonna need to be dredged.
Do you want to start with why 2050 is important and then the plan after?
So this was something that the group did talk quite a bit around, and the 2050 timeframe aligns with a couple of key other dates that are relevant from a planning perspective, and kind of provides operation within a period of somewhat known certainty that we can work around. So 2050 aligns with the DNR lease terms of the marinas. 2050 also happens to align with some key regional comprehensive planning processes, lots 2050 plan, I believe the port's plan is 2050. So within it, though it is only an 18-year term from planning an MOU beyond that did not feel there needed to be an opportunity at that point for pause renegotiation. What have we learned?
Is that normally what happens? Like you do one and then you do another one kind of a thing?
That is up to the entities who are around the table at that time. We can't speak beyond, but it's certainly the intention of the agreement not to leave everyone high and dry at that point, but to re-enter into some kind of a conversation about what to do next.
But that's why essentially the state's funding is kind of front loaded so that the state's not paying 75% of the maintenance And then all of a sudden the state goes away in 2050 because you have different people at the table. You guys are giving me a blank look. Am I misinterpreting?
I would state that differently.
Okay.
Um,
You're like, no. I'm not afraid to say the wrong thing in a public meeting. I do it all the time. That's how I learn. So educate me.
I think let me just add something to Sarah and then get to your question. Pragmatically, you know, we keep saying 18 years and I should explain that. Based on what I described about like if all the funding comes and, you know, and we're hitting our construction targets, the earliest the dam can come out is 2033. And so when we do 2033 to the end, it's 2050. So that gives us 18 years. And then we just play the average. Yes, we're going to be hitting the average. We get 3 dredge events. So we will learn a lot about how this is working after 3 dredge events. How is it actually working for DNR to oversee and everyone else in their operations and maintenance responsibilities? We're also going to learn a lot about cost, and that this whole thing is predicated on an annual payment and enough money to be able to execute those dredge events when the significance criteria are tripped. So, and the marina leases are up at 2050, not to say that they won't be renewed. The planning, as Sarah just said, all of the, you know, planning forecasting right now is for 2050. And so when you put that together with like pragmatically, we should actually have some adaptive management opportunity built in. Then you get this provision that we have in the MOU that says we will all come together 1 year before 2050 and figure out, is this working? How do we revise? How do we move forward? So that is really the driver for that relative to how the state works. You know, the state still has the same 15% that everybody else does. So they're not getting off or getting a better deal than anybody else. It's really just about let's come back together after we've seen this through. And we know that the landscape is shifting a little bit or has the opportunity by 2050, given all of the long range planning efforts.
Yeah, and I would say like, you know, we've got things going with sea level rise. We've got just a lot of things that are happening in this general vicinity. So just kind of watching it all lines up along that.
Just that the state's investments are front loaded in the sense that they are paying for all the capital costs, and the rationale for that is that it was their dam and, you know, so.
Yeah.
But once we get into the ongoing maintenance piece, the state's investment is the same as everybody else's.
But then I would also say, you know, when we look at the different responsibilities of like, for example, Fish and Wildlife taking on the decontamination station, there's a cost associated with that. When we look at DNR and some of the associated responsibility, when we look at governance, there's also something associated with, which is not necessarily quantified in a number here, but those are those ongoing operations and maintenance that the state will take on.
Right.
And so, you know, we put it in the wheelhouse of the agencies that it makes the most sense, but there are still realized costs that come from the work that's associated with that. So it's not a one and done. Those are kind of are in perpetuity actually outside of what we're seeing to pay in for the long-term operations and maintenance. So.
And I remember one of the things that came up during the EIS was the upland disposal versus in-water disposal, and it being pretty likely based on what our consultants are telling us that our project is going to be heavily upland disposal because of the contamination levels. And so what you're saying is, because you're making that assumption that that will be removed, then you don't have to have that additional cost within this math problem because we've upland disposed of it. And so now you can in-water dispose of it.
That's exactly right, because what we're gonna be dredging is the new sediment that will have been deposited by the Deschutes River, and our sampling shows that it meets criteria for in-water disposal. So long as yours is gone.
Right.
I have 2 questions. One, the regulatory authority we have a lot of concerned citizens who are worried that the idea of capping. So first we take the really toxic stuff and the port deals with it and gets rid of it. And what I'm hearing is there's a possibility though that for some low level toxicity, it can be capped by the new sediment that comes in. Who is the regulatory authority and the scientist who will make that judgment of what's safe? When does it happen? Yeah, what's that?
The regulatory authority is the Department of Ecology. And the scientists that would be making that determination is a combination of would be led by your team in coordination with our team. And so, because you all have a group of consultants working with you to design the cleanup action plan. So when we look at cleanup action across a broad area, what happens often is that you will collect sediment samples to understand the extent of your contamination. And that will help to inform how you clean up that contamination. So areas that are really dirty and contaminated need to be removed from the system, and that often occurs through dredging. And you would think about that anyways in areas of navigation, because you want to get that accumulated sediment out. The reason why we discuss this other possibility is if there are areas of really low contamination, what Ecology or US EPA, depending on who's the lead here, for you guys, it's Ecology. What they sometimes allow or even prescribe, if they're the lead, is something called natural recovery or monitored natural recovery. These are technical terms that they use. MNR is monitored natural recovery. That is a concept that assumes and suggests that sediment that is coming from upstream has been sampled and is clean, and it can naturally recover or be deposited over and help to recover the sediments of low contamination that remain in the system.
Is that technically the same thing as beneficial reuse?
Beneficial reuse, no, is where you remove sediment from a system and you beneficially reuse it somewhere else. So where you would dredge it and place it on the shoreline, like what we're planning to do, that would be the correct use.
So
of
natural
that.
recovery is, and
Yes.
then,
And then settle it.
rather than.
Yep, and that's, yep, exactly. Exactly, and that's only appropriate in areas of low contamination and areas where you don't need the depth to dredge. And so what we're proposing and what we have on one of our slides is we would really like to be in close coordination with your team so that as you guys are getting your sampling results and understanding your areas of, potentially low contamination, and we're getting our updated numerical modeling, is there an opportunity for us to be thinking about this together? Because if there is, it's huge cost savings for the port, and that's due diligence that we should do together. And so we just think that's really important, and we hope to be closely coordinated on that in 2024.
And would the community sounding board be the mechanism for if there are concerned citizens who don't fully understand how the plan is, not for beneficial reuse, but for
Natural recovery or monitored
natural recovery, will there be an opportunity to learn about that there?
We could inform them there at that point, certainly. However, the Department of Ecology will see to it as part of their approval process for a cleanup action plan that your cleanup action plan goes out for public comment. And so this is something that is led by the Department of Ecology, and there is an opportunity for public review and comment on those documents.
I think to Commissioner Vasavada's point, this is something to star for our communications team, and it might be relevant to you guys. We are getting feedback with concerns about beneficial reuse and natural recovery. And so an education as to who those decision makers are, we need to be telling that story. So that we can help people understand that this is a science evidence-based practice that Ecology is overseeing and
Totally.
measuring, and
It's based
Um,
on very specific criteria that are, codified in law. And the analysis that you do helps to demonstrate that you're meeting those criteria or not. So that's something that, your team, your consultant team is probably very much in the weeds on, and we can help to. For the beneficial reuse, I think probably what they're saying is, that's dirty stuff. We don't want to put that back. And that goes to a whole different regulatory arm called the DMFP.
And then another easy time. Oh, 4 minutes.
Oh, I thought we had 90 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay, great. And possibly for Jonathan or Sean, as you think through $150,000 a year, that's not the exact number.
Around 120 department.
Close.
Depending on when we start.
There are different ways that presumably an institution like ours finances something like that. Can you just quickly speak to the different, and if you can't, it's okay. Just general ways that we might finance that kind of an investment?
haven't given it too much thought yet.
Yeah, let me, I think that would be more appropriate for us to take offline with Tad, Finance Director, and talk about that. But I just, having just heard what I've heard so far, and I'll go out on a limb and suggest that if the port starts planning in its capital budget every year, that's gonna, just like we do in all the other things, and say, we're earmarking 150,000 to wherever, then it'll accumulate.
And one of the things Commissioner and I have been wanting to have a conversation about is if we're making $150,000 in our real estate, then we can allocate, looking at our business lines as opportunities for funding of some of these projects is an internal way that we can go about.
Yeah, and I apologize if I missed this earlier on, but what is the financial institution or vehicle that's going to start collecting this money? So if is it the individual contributors that are going to earmark it within their own budgets and keep it? Or is there a financial vehicle that every year we're going to pay into?
The latter, and that's something that we'll be discussing during the funding and governance work group coordination this year.
You guys look trustworthy. We'll just give it.
We got a big thing.
Okay, so I think we're doing okay on time. We have 30 minutes left, and I think we just have 3 or 4 slides. Oh, but actually, Sarah, before we get to this one, is there anything else that you wanted to add? I didn't want to skip over you.
I think we've covered most of the points here. I would just reiterate, I guess, that the Funding and Governance Group has covered a lot of territory to get to the MOU. You know, new folks coming in have curiosity probably about a lot of that, and you know, we would encourage questions, but there, you know, was a lot of deliberation about why we ended up where we did, and a particular benefit to the ILA structure over another structure is that it really is built on demonstrated regional success. LOT is organized in this way. And we were looking for the sort of least complexity and adding additional layers of bureaucracy and process to go through. And this achieves the objectives with the least complexity. And so it is maybe among the most politically feasible options to move forward, especially along the time frame that we're looking at putting it together. And importantly, it provides local flexibility and accommodates the different circumstances and structures and funding strategies of each of the individuals involved. So it kind of ticked all of those boxes. And here we are today with it. Yeah, I think we've covered the other points here.
I just want to say, because I usually do say it, those are in $2022, so I don't want anybody to hold on to any number. And then the other thing is I do want everybody to hold on to the number and the sense of we did, and Sarah said it, we put a lot of time into this, and we have to get to the end of this year with an interlocal agreement. And if we start to retool the different percentages, which was really, really well thought out, we were trying to be, and everybody was on board. What will be a challenge as folks start to question a point here or there. There was a lot of thinking in this in order for us to move, I think, collectively, for us to start where the MOU was as our starting point and start to negotiate things like what's the financial mechanism? Those are going to be the things, and how do we allocate the assets if we haven't thought about it? That would be our starting point for those MOU discussions. So.
And the city of Olympia is on board with their larger. Okay.
And was it formerly the executive director, Sam Gibney, who was our representative to the group?
Sam and Commissioner Downing was also part of it, and then
Yes.
Lisa Parks.
Lisa Parks, yeah.
Those are technical.
Lisa Parks was our technical, Commissioner Downing was our elected, and then Sam Gibney, Director Gibney was the executive work group.
Okay. Okay, so what are we up to in 2024? We described that we are, our goal is to be a conceptual design by mid-2024 and 30% by the end of the year. And one of the disciplines that we'll be working through is numerical modeling and sediment control. And it is in all of our best interest to identify opportunities to minimize the amount of sediment deposition at the port and marinas compared to what we projected in the EIS. And so what you're seeing on the screen is a snapshot of an analysis that we completed with our numerical modeling in the EIS to look at, could dredging a sediment trap or a bench minimize sediment? Could installing a structure like a breakwater alongside the western end of the Olympia Yacht Club, could that work? What about if we did the two of them together? And what we found through that analysis is that really these options don't have good feasible or produce significant results such that we would explore them further. And I can go into more detail on that if there are questions. But the point, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna get to that, because in the resolution passed in 2023, it actually states that the
Yep.
board believes that it must include state funding to implement a sediment mitigation structure. I don't know if that's part of the plan or.
That's exactly part of, that's consistent with the analysis that we're embarking on in 2024. So what our next steps are is that Tuesday of next week, we'll be meeting with representatives from all of the marinas to hear from them. What smart ideas do you all have to help us think through opportunities to minimize sediment deposition at the marinas? Then based on the ideas that come out of that, there will be some regulatory entities that we need to check with about the regulatory feasibility of those. And we'll also brief you on the ideas that we hear. Once we identify kind of the pool of feasible concepts, we'll put that into our numerical model along with the updated habitat surface, because we're advancing the habitat design. And we'll look at those two together to determine, has that reduced our sediment deposition at the marinas and at the port? We should have an understanding of that about mid-year. And at that point, we'll bring it back to this group and the funding and governance work group, report out on it for one. And then we can make a decision at that time, whether we bring updated values into the interlocal agreement, or if we hold those because the existing values represent a reasonable worst case and are at an annual funding level that all of the entities have been able to vision within their operating budgets. So that'll be a discussion.
I can offer a little bit of context as to the resolution. It wasn't that the commission was trying to be engineers. It was more so anticipating this uncertainty as to funding and wanting there to be proaction on the front end as to how the project was designed so that it would mitigate the sediment, the dredging, the maintenance dredging. So if that is not the case, if it is not improving the maintenance dredging to do these engineered solutions, then I think that would, be reasonable. As far as an adjustment, and we have a new commission now who could make another resolution, but that was the intent, was don't do this thing and then stick us with a bunch of costs of dredging because you didn't do the thing in a way that would have made it self-sustaining.
Yeah.
If that's not possible, or if there's, that was the intent.
Thanks for that context.
And I think the way that it's structured so that these smaller users are not footing the bill does impact mitigating that like from an economic development perspective, that the municipalities and governing bodies are the ones footing the maintenance bill is a little bit easier than these small marinas and these small organizations who don't necessarily have the certainty and predictability. So I think that speaks to that intent in the resolution as well, because that was part of what went into that at the time.
There are ways that we can help mitigate that for folks like the marinas, absolutely, if there's a possible way to move that forward. So, and that's gonna be a really good conversation. It's like next week, isn't it? So.
Yep.
Because they're gonna be bringing their smart ideas and potentially some engineers, and we'll have the right people in the room to start to talk about what is a real possibility or not. But it's very good context to know kind of where that.
Well, and back then, everyone was like, well, what if this or what if that? So I think now you're getting some more answers to and more real dollars and more real, it's easier to have the conversation.
We'll be sure to be reporting out on this.
Thank you.
That's our commitment here. Okay.
Yeah, I'll cover this, though. I will say we've touched on almost all of these things through this conversation so far, but maybe just to make it very clear, we are on a legislatively mandated deadline of getting this moved into an ILA by the end of this year. And that might feel a little aggressive, especially when you kind of walk back from that date through what each individual partner's adoption process might look like. But we have good hope that the very good work that was done in getting the MOU together and the agreements that were made among all the partners that signed on to that MOU will provide a really solid foundation, especially given that it builds from this sort of concept of shared benefits that has agreed to. So at this point, what we're imagining is transitioning from the same MOU assumptions into essentially legally binding language in an ILA that also gives us the benefit of being able to incorporate any of the updated sediment control assumptions that we were just talking about moments ago. Process-wise, we are at the very beginning of this transition moment. That's why we're here today. We do anticipate that we'll hold a similar process to what we used in the development of the MOU, which was a series of one-on-one conversations and then group meetings and then one-on-one conversations and group meetings. The benefit of that is that it gives an opportunity for a lot of discussion that's specific to an entity. And then we can take that and sort of process that into something that can then be shared with the whole. So we're anticipating maintaining that. We are going to be continuing to provide updates to the marinas throughout the process starting next week. So we're hoping at this point that we can just hear from you all, any additional questions that you may have about the process or what this transition might look like, but also any challenges or opportunities that you see from your perspective that you think we need to be taking into consideration as we're at the beginning part of this transition to an ILA.
I had a question about, you mentioned $2022. Is there a plan to update the schedule for what's projection for inflation? At the end of this year, our 120 is already going to be 130.
Yeah.
Look at, and so I would imagine people are going to want to have a look at that.
I'll just make another plug for having the marine trade folks involved, because I think unanticipated consequences when we are looking at projects like this, that's my takeaway of this, our project, your project, the overall project, which now are working together, is that we need everyone in concert, otherwise it's not gonna work. And although there are differences with the navigable channel, it seems like they should at least be part of the conversation. Bless you.
When you think of all the work that's happening at the city, the state, and now the ports, I mean, it's a significant regional body of work that's happening. And the more we can coordinate with those that are even impacted on the fringes, I think we're just gonna have a better projects altogether. So I appreciate that.
Well, and dredging is so unique that people that are in the marine trades are probably more likely to have confronted dredging than any of our other partners. You know, like the city of Tumwater is not doing dredging. Just expertise.
Yeah, actually, let me say a couple things on that. So one of the things that we'll consider this year is the timing to update the cost estimates. And it could be mid-year based on updated sediment deposition, or it could hold. And the potential benefit of it holding is that you all are going to learn a lot about dredging in West Bay when you embark on your dredge event from 25 to 27. And while much of that will go upland, we will still have valuable information from how much that costs down here. Additionally, the marinas have to conduct a dredge events to comply with their updated DNR leases. So that's other values that allow us to understand what's it cost to dredge at the marinas. We costed them differently in our initial assumptions. We could get updated information there. So learning from the dredging. And then also our team has engineering qualifications specific to the type of dredging that we're proposing. And that's what helped us to cost initially, and we'll retain that for the duration of the contract.
What's the anticipated fate of that 500,000 cubic yards being dredged from the channel? Is that open water?
That all is beneficially reused and to create the shoreline habitat within the new estuary. All of it, yep. And so otherwise it would be more of a mudflat environment. And so beneficially reusing it within the project area allows us to create that rich ecological and visual diversity on the shorelines.
I guess the question is, different challenges that you see in this. I will state that, when we look at support the 2025 legislative request, for folks who've worked in the state, we often have to walk things back. So December, even if we come up with, a signed interlocal agreement, the state typically goes through the same budget process of needing information to the governor's office by like September timeframe to be included. And although this isn't a budget ask, it's an important component of that as we start to move these ideas forward for a large capital request. The governor's office would also like to know where we are in these negotiations. So that's another, something a little bit more challenging from the state level, but I guess I'd be curious as to what would be some challenges that we could see. Or are there other things that we should take into consideration from the way that you all make decisions, and anything that could help us set our timeline if we start to walk back from when we need decisions to be made? And y'all might need to think about it too. And
Director Rudolph might be able to speak to it better, but we heard a briefing from our Marina staff lead that we are getting to a point of kind of urgency to do dredging there. And so to the extent that we're trying to, for synergies with joint planning, there's gonna have to be, on the design technical side, like the timeline for getting folks together feels pretty urgent to me. Similarly, the sea level rise, I remember during the campaign saying, oh, we should coordinate all these things. And then an astute person said, how? And I said, oh, I guess we'll ask Ann Larson. Like, I mean, we've mentioned these opportunities, but like how you actually weave these things together, who's thinking, how's that gonna be done? Which group do you see that happening with?
so we have, we'll be coordinating very closely with the city of Olympia and multiple choice, the parks development that they're doing when we look at public works for the bridge. And so we are connected. I sit on the executive work group with Sean on the Sea Level Rise executive group. We're also, the state is sitting on some of the technical group too. And I think that's an opportunity for us to better coordinate, and even like if there are ways to engage the state even more in a stronger role, that's definitely a place that I'm trying to bring in a presence. So we're trying to sit in those places. And if there are areas, as Tessa mentioned, when we're looking at the port and some of the work that you're doing, how can we come to the table? How can we bring our technical expertise so that we're building these two projects, together versus like separately? Because as Tessa mentioned, there's a real opportunity to make some savings out of these two projects if we think about them happening together. The timing of it's going to be important, how we could potentially use the sediment to help your project, even in the funding. I mean, we're going after all of these dollars for federal money. And the more that we have synergy with these projects together, thinking about this in more of a regional context, if we're going after federal monies with the tribes, with the city, with the state and the ports together, that's a pretty robust ask when we're looking for federal appropriations, direct ask to our congressional folks. So
And I think from the political landscape, because the port was a little bit late to the party as far as declaring our formal support for both projects. Politically, there are people that see the estuary project as very geographically specific in an estuary project, who those same people are in support of the economic development that comes from ports and navigable shipping channels. And so now that we have formally declared our support for the projects working in concert, leveraging that economic development, we already have plenty of support on the environmental benefits. We have wonderful support with Squaxins and Olympia, and but I do think because we didn't publicly state our support for both projects, did not allow you to leverage the economic piece, which now that should be possible. And I think that could be a total game changer politically, because it's no longer just a local environmental project. It's now an environmental project that's leveraging our ability to use our navigable channel. And we have great work being done in by our communications department about one of our marine terminal customers who has a very environmentally friendly product and how they want to come here more. And I really see that as being something that we could that we didn't do. You weren't able to do last year. We weren't able to do last year, but could be huge this year.
you may be late to the party, but you're at the party now.
Party. What we said in the meeting, they were like, "It's not really gonna do anything. You're kind of late." I'm like, "It doesn't matter."
Because we're both starting to work now, and thank you for saying that. I mean, this is a critical juncture where we have such a great opportunity to leverage those relationships. So even though you're a little late, you didn't miss the
We're
party.
here.
Party's still happening.
And just to build on the growing party, so you heard from Commissioner Harding about the importance of sort of engaging the industry stakeholders. Well, I would imagine the Northwest Marine Trades Association might be a very helpful partner in this broader advocacy. So what
Totally.
you're signaling is some big partners that to the table.
That's great.
Disco ball.
So, our last meeting, Commissioner Sanders and I will be your key point people from the commission side. I will be the lead for the Deschutes Estuary Working Group. Commissioner Sanders is the lead for the Sea Level Rise Group, and we're going to closely coordinate on that.
Which was our next,
Yeah, that was the perfect segue, because we were just gonna ask that question. So our primary point of contact, which we just established. And then,
but just a sec, so you're gonna be our primary point of contact. So who should be the people in the room if we're having some of the more targeted conversation? Camille, would it be you? And
Well,
Commissioner?
Yeah, Sean, yeah, because Sean's.
I can be.
You, of course you
Okay,
can.
okay.
You're with the disco ball.
DJ, man, you don't even know it.
So we'll kind of continue, but we'll be including the two board commissioners as well.
Well, the other piece of this that I think's that, it's gonna be an important part of the puzzle is we're gonna have a new executive director soon
Yes.
as well. And so I appreciate that we're doing this education here today. And bringing
We'll do it again.
Yeah, to the party, but we really need to take the time to make sure that we unpack, if they're not already familiar with the EIS, that they understand that and the MOU and out, the critical nature of, forming that ILA before September comes and you start having conversations about budget with governor's office and, So
Yeah,
there's,
once you get that person on board, just let us know and we'd be happy to do a briefing at any level of depth, because not knowing what their background is gonna be, if they're from the Olympia area, there's just so much rich history. We could talk about the EIS and how we got to this point today, because this is just such a short overview for some of the new faces and, so yeah.
We'll be deciding on finalists after this, so you will have an idea of who those people are. Hopefully they are already up to speed on all of this.
But for that, who is then the key, who's the point of contact for internal coordination?
For staff.
or,
Sean?
yeah, he is. If it's commission affairs and you're like, okay, we need to start coming back together again as a group to the commission, then I'll Sean and I are pretty good at coordinating though.
So you guys will be on my little CC list, the three.
Yeah.
Certainly for technical issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so some of much of what we'll talk about or negotiate in this coming year are, the legalese in the ILA, assumptions around timing for payment and those maintaining that payment. Does that still run through you, Sean?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Just want to make sure I have that clear in my notes. And then our goal is to, as we've stated, have the process fully completed and executed by the end of the year. What can we do to support you to, have your commission briefed and signature by the end of the year? And what does that approval process look like?
I'd say continued coordination as we go through the year for sure, and we'll be presenting to the commission more than one time throughout the year. So we'll be updating them on progress. And then we'll route it through as we do normal interlocal agreements to get commissioner approval, which will include advisory sessions and really ask for authorization to enter into ILA. So
So ideally, there's an advisory session 2 weeks before the action. And in December, there tends to be just one jammed meeting.
Yep.
So it would be ideal to shoot for mid-November for the action and end of October for the advisory. The latest.
Not sure how we want to time it with the budget, but I know we did the budget at the end of.
Yeah, I might suggest that we're gonna make an attempt to get out in front of this early so that we're not gonna run into crunch time.
Well, that was one of my questions. When are we actually going to be contributing to this fund? 2033? Or
The current assumption in the MOU that we do intend to carry forward is once the state has received funding for construction, that's when the annual payments start.
Okay, so I mean, our budget process starts in June. So realistically, if you want this included in our budget, we need to be including it starting in June.
And that budget process, is that a 2-year?
It's 1 year.
It's just 1 year, okay.
And I will engage the commission offline on some ideas on that.
Because if we were to get funding in 2025, that would be at the end. So you.
Okay, so it was,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be until 2025 regardless. Okay,
Got it.
so then that's less of an issue.
But that's still what we're funding this year.
Oh, right. Oh, it's just flying by.
We're just whispering on the side to say, I
Can
think
we hit everything?
set a follow-up action item to kick off a technical coordination meeting with your teams, so that we can, brief them on the timing of our project and potential sediment deposition and give you any information that could help and, just get that sediment coordination going. So is that something you all would be willing, to engage on starting in the next month or so, a separate coordination track? Okay.
Sean and Jonathan, if there are like places where you think, knowing that you probably have ongoing meetings where we should be in the room, maybe thinking about that too. Just how we can be helpful to conversations you're already having, so.
Yeah, I think engagement between your team and our Bud Inlet Solar team is gonna be very important. So I would envision some meetings, shared meetings like that.
Great.
At the end of the first quarter, maybe.
Perfect. We'll reach out and get some dates that'll work.
And just out from the commission and the organization as a whole, we have had a lot of staff turnover. And this is an exciting opportunity for all of us to work together. And just, I think I speak for the whole commission when I say we're very excited about this. And just know that we don't know what we don't know. So we're still working on being a part of the party. So if reach out to us if we are not engaging in something, because we might just we've had so much turnover that there are meetings or efforts that we just aren't on our radar. So assume positive intent that we want to be good participants in this process.
And I'll keep that in mind. I was thinking when we were pulling this presentation, I think you all have some of the newest faces around the
Yeah.
table. And so there could have been a couple areas where we maybe even walked it back to a little bit 101. So apologies for that, but would
Yeah.
love to follow up if there are other questions. If we want to spend a few hours together over coffee, anybody to talk about this, totally fine. Jasmine knows where I'm at most.
Sediment and coffee.
Party for me, my disco ball.
These drinks have caffeine in them.
Come on, I'm gonna need a different kind of drink if we're gonna.
Again, we didn't do the
Looks
sponge.
like you got a discount.
Well, are there any other questions for our distinguished guests? Commissioner Sanders, Commissioner Thomas?
No questions. I just really appreciate the opportunity to learn. This has been a part of what I wanted to learn about from the very beginning of being sworn in. So this is really exciting work that you guys are doing, and a lot of collaboration and teamwork, a lot of technical information. So I'm excited.
Yeah, this truly is a legacy project, and for those that live in Olympia, which I do, it's just super exciting to be a part of this, so just want to thank you for your time.
Underscore that, right?
Yes.
Anybody who's lived here for a period of time knows the importance of this, and I am so appreciative of you taking the time to brief us, Commissioner Harding brought it up that we have new faces at the table. But I know the staff that are here today were very interested in environmental issues. I think that's part of the reason that we were brought on, is because our environmental commitment and our passion for public outreach and partnering. So I know that from the staff perspective, we could be happier to be helping advance.
And thank you for getting us on the meeting agenda today. It was Herculean effort sometime to get all these important people in the same room, so thank you.
Thank you all. Well, thank you for joining us. It's 4:55
Oh,
at 4:56, and we'll be moving to the next item on the action calendar, which is a briefing from Cliff Moore. But if people want to take a moment to themselves, what do we do, Trevor? We adjourn and come back, or we
You
don't
can take a
adjourn?
break.
Take a break.
Yeah, 5 minute, you want 5 minutes?
We'll take a 5-minute break. Come
Back
back.
at
Very good, very good.
5:01. 5:01.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you. We've called this meeting back to order, and the next item on our agenda is we have an update from our fearless recruiter Cliff Moore, who's going to make recommendations to us regarding the executive director recruitment. Because it's a special meeting, in theory, there's no public comment sort of set in the agenda for this meeting, but I'd like my commissioners to think about if there is any public comment available, perhaps we can make that opportunity possible. But for now, we can turn it to you, Cliff. Thank you. And please share what you have for us at the Port of Olympia.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate the opportunity to address you this evening regarding your search for a new executive director. As I've previously reported, from an applicant pool of 34 individuals, I conducted preliminary interviews with 15 individuals. Applicant materials and notes from those interviews were shared with commissioners. And on January 22nd, you met to discuss the characteristics you're looking for in your next executive director. Using the lens of those comments from January 22nd, I went back to the application packets and carefully re-reviewed all the material. Tonight, for your consideration, I am prepared to make a recommendation for finalists for the executive director position. So any questions on that, or may I proceed?
Cliff, this is Jasmine, Commissioner Pasavada. My one question is, are all of these 4 people who you're recommending aware that you're making the recommendation and that they're going to be going public today?
We have been careful to have communication with applicants that you haven't made a decision yet on this. And so until you actually make a decision, nobody is a finalist. But we have alerted applicants that they may be under consideration for this.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So with that, then, in alphabetical order, commissioners, I would recommend Joshua Cummings, Anthony Hempstead, Mike Reed, and Alexandra Smith as finalists for your executive director position.
For the sake of folks who are writing vigorously, could you repeat them one more time, Cliff?
Absolutely. Joshua Cummings, Anthony Hempstead, Mike Reed, and Alexandra Smith.
You need a motion. Does the chair need a motion?
Is there discussion?
You can ask for discussion now or after the motion and second, either way.
Which would you prefer? I'll make a motion and then we can have discussion. So I move that Joshua Cummings, Anthony Hempstead, Mike Reed, and Alexandra Smith move forward as finalists for the Port of Olympia Executive Director position.
Second.
Right, now is there discussion? Commissioner?
I appreciate the time our consultant Cliff Moore spent in doing these interviews and his thorough briefings as to how those went. And I'm excited about us moving forward with interviews with those candidates.
Commissioner Sanders?
Yes, I'm really excited to be moving forward with our executive director. It's going to be an awesome opportunity to move forward into 2024 with a leader at the helm. And so, thank you.
Commissioner Tong? I don't have anything. Okay, I would just add that these 4 candidates, I think one of the qualifications that all of us as commissioners really valued at this moment in our history at the Port of Olympia was connectedness to Thurston County and to our community. And so what I notice that you picked up on, Mr. Moore, is these are all candidates who do have local ties here and are aware, kind of embedded in our current stakeholder politics in Thurston County. I would ask that these people's resumes, we of course received 35 resume, or not 35, but a greater number to review. Will it be possible to make these public so that the members of the public can learn about the qualifications of our finalists?
That's probably a question for your attorney.
Application materials are considered confidential normally, so I'm happy to discuss it with you offline, but typically those are not produced.
Those are not,
Yes, RTW 42, something or other,
Are exempt from-
recruitment materials are exempt from the public disclosure laws.
It's application materials.
okay.
For the privacy of the applicant.
Right.
Correct.
Okay, well then I'll just set that to the side because we're in the middle of a motion and I was commenting. So it sounds like we have a motion on the table to approve the recommendation of these 4 candidates: Joshua Cummings, Anthony Hempstead, Mike Reed, and Alexandra Smith. And the motion has been seconded. Anyone opposed? No. And well then,
All those in favor?
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Right, and opposed, none. So the motion carries and we will be recommending these 4 for our finalists. Can staff give an update again to the public about what the process from here and how people will be able to learn about the candidates?
Yeah, I think we've done a number of correspondence. We're using our communications department to get out notices. Those haven't, I don't know how far those have gone out or what the level of detail is. But we're sending out notices through the newspapers, local newspapers, and there's a number of areas where people are aware of the public reception. And if we have more to do, then maybe that's true. I think it's a better question for Tabor. I'm not sure exactly.
I can help with that. So we'll be sending a news release out that announces the February 5th public reception where candidates and the public can come together. So that news release will go to local media and hopefully we anticipate that our local media outlets will share that to have a broad reach.
And that is at what time and where?
It is February 5th. And I'm gonna be gone, so.
5:30 PM at the Hilton Garden Inn off of Henderson Boulevard in Olympia.
We'll also be emailing anybody who subscribes to the email list and we'll share that on social media as well.
Thank you, Camille. Will the notice include a brief resume and not the application materials, but a brief biography about each candidate?
Yeah, there won't be a resume, but I think Cliff plans to have some sort of background information on the candidate, their profile at the public meeting. I don't know that that's going out in advance. It'd be a question for Cliff, but I don't think I know their resumes aren't going out, but maybe a little bit of background and
Well, without a motion, I would encourage Cliff and staff to include some background about the
to the
individual.
extent, that we can, yeah.
If I might just add, yes, your press release will normally list their names and their current employment, perhaps some of their previous employment. But again, I would recommend that you get that press release reviewed by your attorney before it goes out. The evening of the public reception, we will have comment cards with the names of each candidate and also a brief bio that they will have approved in advance. And those comment cards will be available with a little space to write a comment by each candidate's name. And those will be collected and provided to commissioners to help inform your decision-making process.
And
And
then,
then I just might also add interviews for the finalists will take place the following day on February 6th at the port office. You've tonight selected 4 finalists. And so typically and you have 2 panels, the commissioner panel and an external stakeholder panel. So typically what we'll do is schedule 2 interviews in the morning and the 2 candidates will flip-flop, and then 2 interviews in the afternoon and the candidates will flip-flop. After the interviews are conducted, commissioners have, I believe, a scheduled special meeting where you can go into executive session and then get feedback from the external stakeholder panel and then consider the qualifications for hire. You may choose to make a motion when you come out of that in open session, or you may choose to think about it for a few days or a week or take it up at your next regularly scheduled commission meeting. That's entirely up to commissioners.
I have a follow-up question. So you mentioned that after the interviews, we'll be going into exec session. We can to deliberate. The interviews themselves, are they public interviews that are held or are they private?
For the commissioners, they fall under the RCW that allows for the consideration of employment, credentials for employment in an executive session. Rick, I would ask you to comment on the stakeholder session.
Yeah, the interviews related to evaluating the qualifications of an applicant are executive session interviews, and that's typically how they occur.
For the commission.
Yes, also for the other committee.
When the other committee does stakeholder interviews, are they doing them almost as a subcommittee designated by us? So they are doing it in exec session of the Port of Olympia?
That's correct. They are a subcommittee of the commission.
Did anyone else have any questions for Cliff or does any comments on the recruitment?
Exciting.
There was not public comment. We've already taken that action. Are you able to let us know? Is there anyone seeking to make public comment at this time?
Well, for point of order, we would have needed, I think, to change our agenda at the front of that to include that. And just so you feel confident that our resolution doesn't call for public comment on action items. His public comment has been held at the advisory sessions leading up to this. If that's helpful at all.
Did you have one more comment you wanted to make?
Well, no, it's, I think Camille is right about your policy. The commission does have, in my opinion, discretion to allow for public comment, but doesn't appear there is any here.
All right.
And this is an open meeting, so people could be in the audience right now. Maybe they are on Zoom.
Well, then
So
thank you.
Commissioners, I'll just say I'll be there the evening of the 5th to help facilitate that reception, and I'll be there with you on the 6th for the interviews, and I'll be facilitating commissioners panel and then helping coordinate the debrief at the end of the interviews.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we really hope that the people who've been so engaged in wanting to make sure that the Port of Olympia is a good steward of the public trust, we invite you to come and join and meet these candidates. I hope you'll be impressed. I have been so far by the resumes, and we're very excited. And with that, I think we've completed our agenda for today. It's 5:13 p.m. and this meeting is adjourned.